Good afternoon, and welcome to the second in our series of Made by McGill webcasts, where we invite McGill experts to provide insight behind the headlines on major events and topics in the news. My name is Derek Kassoff. I'm the Managing Director of Communications at McGill's Office of University Advancement, and this is Beyond Super Tuesday, an alumni webcast on the U.S. elections. I'm thrilled to be joined today by two of McGill's leading experts on American politics. To my immediate right is Professor Jason Opal, Chair of the Department of History and Classical Studies at McGill's Faculty of Arts, and a political contributor to many esteemed U.S. publications, including the Washington Post and the LA Times. You're also an expert in the U.S. Constitution, gun violence, early and modern U.S. politics, race relations, and the history of disease. So I think we might be having you back a few times on this series. And to his right is David Shribman, the J.W. McConnell Professor of Practice at McGill's Max Bell School of Public Policy. Professor Shribman is a one-time Washington bureau chief for the Boston Globe, where he won a Pulitzer Prize, and longtime executive editor of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, where among many other achievements, he led the coverage of the Tree of Life synagogue shooting, which in turn led to a second Pulitzer Prize. Welcome, gentlemen. We certainly have a lot to talk about this week when it comes to U.S. politics. So just to set the scene for everyone, we are recording this on Friday, March 6th, just 3 days after the stunning developments in the Democratic primary, where Super Tuesday quickly went from becoming what could have been a Bernie Sanders coronation into essentially a two-man race between Senator Sanders and Joe Biden. So let's start with Super Tuesday and what has happened actually in the couple of days since then. I guess the first question I'll ask each of you is, were you surprised by the developments we've seen this week? Jason?
I was surprised how quickly the Democratic Party, a large part of the Democratic Party, consolidated around Biden. It's an example of all kinds of things. I mean, electoral politics is about kind of implicit alliances between different kinds of voters, and I was surprised at how quickly moderate voters who are just concerned for various reasons about Bernie Sanders consolidated around Biden. I also was surprised to see how quickly Democratic leaders endorsed him in key states and lined up behind him. And it goes to show, among other things, that moderate voters are not necessarily, can still be passionate voters and can still really turn out. And that carried Mr. Biden to an extremely good night.
Great. And David, what struck you the most about?
What struck me was the empire struck back. The Democratic establishment, which has been terrified for months about Bernie Sanders, they hold him in the same contempt with which he holds them, worried about a class warfare nominee, worried about a nominee who wasn't even a member of their party, though they'll be running against an incumbent president who's not a member of his party either. They were desperate to find a way out of this situation. They didn't want to spend the entire autumn talking about why Bernie Sanders spent his honeymoon in the Soviet Union and why he loved Cuba so much and kissing Florida goodbye. And so they're desperate to find a safe harbor. They found a safe harbor in Joe Biden, but the question, of course, is how safe is that harbor? If any of you told any of us who were around Washington 25 years ago that Joe Biden would be the savior of America, you would have been laughed off the stage.
Really, but he was a two-term vice president. I mean, there is that sort of normal course where many vice presidents do end up running for and winning the presidency.
Well, that's true, but Dan Quayle was a one-term vice president, and Vice President Marshall under Woodrow Wilson, you probably know this quote, said that there was a mother who had three sons. One died, one went to sea, and the third was never heard from again. He became vice president.
True enough. So in your comments on what happened this week, I heard a lot of Bernie Sanders and reaction to Bernie Sanders. Can we give Joe Biden any credit for in terms of what he may have done, or?
I think so. So one of the most striking things is that he really rallied African American votes in the South, and he really dominated the South. I mean, there were literally counties, Alabama and Arkansas. He won every single county, and he did that by being physically present. He did it in a kind of old-fashioned ground game to rally, especially older African-American voters in the South, who are an extremely important part of the Democratic electorate in those states, to his campaign. Many of those voters noted, Bernie Sanders was not here and physically there, nor was Mr. Bloomberg, even though Mr. Bloomberg was all over the airwaves and the websites. Yeah, but Biden was there. And so he deserves credit for that, absolutely. And I think, what he's trying to do is a relatively conventional, I will redo or revive the kind of Obama-Clinton years, and I'll win back the states that were lost in 2016 to Mr. Trump.
I think you have to give credit to Joe Biden also for character. for courage and for perseverance. He's a stutterer. I'm a stutterer too, you'll see during the course of this. And he, some of those times, Joe Biden is kind of just drifting off into the ether, and sometimes he just cannot say what he wants to say.
Yeah.
But he had courage and perseverance, and this is his third presidential campaign. The first two ended in debacles. There's still time for this one to do so as well. But Biden is basically a mastodon. He has not become extinct, even though every one of his class has become. You know, Ted Kennedy, Paul Sarbanes, I can name 30 of them who are gone, but he's still here. And so he deserves credit in the Woody Allen thing. 90% of life is showing up. And he showed up in the places the professor mentioned. He showed up in all sorts of places and in all sorts of ways, and he deserves credit for that.
Can I just add to that too? It's really interesting that he, in many southern states, he was talking very specifically when he was present about sort of kitchen table issues. So it's $15 minimum wage, but also particular rail projects or infrastructure projects, targeted for particular areas of the South. And that's it's a practical pitch, and he's a survivor. I mean, that's how he makes his stand.
I would add one caveat though. He won a bunch of states the Republicans will win in
No question
the fall.
about that.
I mean, Joe Biden is more likely to be struck by a meteor than to win South Carolina in the fall.
Or Alabama, yes.
Or Alabama. He has a fighting chance, maybe in Mississippi, maybe in Arkansas, maybe, but otherwise, that's going to be.
So I do want to get eventually to the November election, how that's shaping up. But before we do that, and we still have 2/3 of the delegates in the Democratic primary who have yet to cast their votes. So is this, at this point, is Joe Biden unstoppable, or is there anything Bernie Sanders can do on his end now that it really is a two-person race to rally, or I guess he'd have to expand his base, not just rally his own fans?
It's interesting. I think on Monday and Sunday, I could see Mr. Sanders starting to actually talk about the other side of him, which is I was a long-term sitting senator, and I actually have been a part of many bits of legislation. I'm not just this sort of scary radical. So I think he was actually trying to pitch a little bit towards the middle, and then Super Tuesday happened. So no, he's not dead. He has extremely passionate supporters, and they're not to be dismissed as just the Bernie bro idea. No, he has very strong support among Latinos. He has very strong support among younger voters. And in poorer towns, I was struck by the data shows in states like New Hampshire, struggling towns leaned heavily to Mr. Sanders. They were responding more to his call for a more dramatic kind of change, a more sort of direct kind of class politics. So he's certainly not out of it, but he absolutely needs to concentrate his forces on places like Michigan, upper Midwest states. He'll be strong in the West and weaker in the South, which is why he's already shifting resources from Mississippi, where he's basically giving up, to Michigan.
The other thing is, Bernie's not dead so long as Joe Biden has the capacity to self-destruct himself. And he's done this in 2 campaigns. He's done this in many, many forums. I think it'll be really interesting. We're about 10 days away from Florida. We talked about Latino voters, Hispanic voters. I wonder whether the Cuba talk will hurt Sanders in Florida. I suspect it'll be devastating for him. He's praised Castro. He's talked about health care and literacy as positives for Castro. But I still think that Castro was a huge disadvantage for him in Florida among Hispanic voters.
Right. Well, interesting to see how that plays out. Just a reminder that if you do have any questions for our panelists, you can email us at aoc@mcgill.ca, and we'll try to get to as many questions that come in. We did receive a question a couple days ago from Robert Picard, BA 65 in Richmond, British Columbia. Thank you, Mr. Picard. He writes, if Joe Biden continues to do well enough to lead the pack, can his campaign be successful in recruiting Sanders supporters to, in essence, unite the Democrats so as to defeat Trump in November?
I would say that Mr. Biden certainly can do so for parts of Sanders' coalition. He's not going to win over the Democratic Socialists of America. He's not going to win over readers and subscribers of Jacobin. He's not going to do that. And they might well sit this out. They probably will. But that's only a part of Sanders supporters. And I think that Biden, if he has the resources and the kind of campaign smarts to run a good campaign, he will get substantial support in, as I say, more struggling towns and counties in the United States and Latino voters, not just in Florida, but elsewhere.
I mean, the two of us could write the Biden speech for the Bernie people. If you want better health care than you have now, and certainly better than you would have under Donald Trump, then vote for me. If you want a more progressive income tax or business tax situation, then you have a choice. You can either sit on your hands and have 4 more years of Donald Trump, or you can vote for me and help me shape the future. And I think that's an easy speech to give. I think it's appealing, and I think a lot of these Bernie bros want nothing less than to defeat, nothing more than to defeat Donald Trump. And I think it'll be up to Biden, and I think to some respects up to Sanders to corral them in. And the example, and it didn't work, is 1988 and Jesse Jackson and Michael Dukakis. Jesse Jackson could have done more. He did a little bit. He wanted his own plane, et cetera, et cetera. Give that to Bernie. Give him a plane. Give him the whole Air Force, for God's sakes. But let him fly around and say, no, I might not have supported him, but he's better than Donald Trump.
Right. Now, speaking of sort of rallying, one person who's been, I think, conspicuously silent in all this is President Barack Obama. And generally, you see presidents, automatically throw their support behind their former vice presidents. He's been really quiet on this. Is he just sort of on the sidelines waiting for this?
Well, hold on. I'm not sure I'm not sure that's true. When Vice President Nixon was preparing to run against John Kennedy, Dwight Eisenhower, who served as president while Nixon was asked, what did Nixon accomplish? And he said, if you give me a week, I might think of something. You didn't see George H.W. Bush rally behind Quayle. You saw Walter Mondale run away from Jimmy Carter. So I'm not sure it always works that way.
We shouldn't read too much into that at this point.
I wouldn't overinterpret that.
Right. Okay, here's another question that actually came in this morning from Carl Valet. Interesting. He wrote, it looks like the Democrats will rally around the moderate candidate and keep the populist one at bay. Why couldn't the Republican Party do the same thing 4 years ago?
It's an excellent question. One could say, one of my mentors as an historian writes about regimes of American politics and says that the age of the party, when the parties themselves are very strong institutions, is over. And the parties are now vessels through which other forces, lobbyists, very powerful think tanks and corporate forces sort of channel things. Maybe that is more accurate among the Republicans. The Republican Party as institution really didn't seem able to handle Trump, and he kind of did a hostile takeover of that party. The Democratic Party is very different structurally and ideologically, and it seems to have kind of held up as an institution somewhat better. And ironically, I wonder if that's partly because the Democratic Party, to my mind, is considerably more ideologically diverse than the Republicans are, certainly the Republicans under Trump. The Democratic Party is quite a large tent, and holding that together means that the establishment of the Democratic Party has to be a little bit more flexible, and it seems to have held up better, especially in recent days, than the Republican counterpart in 2016.
The Republican Party in modern times was mostly resembled a fraternal lodge. It was George H.W. Bush's turn. It was Richard Nixon's turn. It was actually Barry Goldwater's turn, though that was a semi-hostile takeover. It was Bob Dole's turn.
Yep.
It was George W. Bush's turn in some respects. So, but I think what happened in 2016 is that Donald Trump ran as a Democrat. He appealed to the people who were Democrats or whose families had been Democrats since 1932 and 1936, to working blue-collar voters, to miners, etc. There's this great, wonderful cartoon of Mrs. Roosevelt coming out of a mine in West Virginia. I mean, who carried West Virginia? It was Trump. He ran as a Democrat. He didn't have modern Democratic planks on his platform, but he had the character. I don't mean the integrity, but I mean the political character of a Democrat.
Very interesting. So I do want to get to the sort of November election, how that's shaping up. Before we do that, I just want to ask a little bit about Michael Bloomberg. I found that whole sort of his entry into the race quite fascinating. Very well financed, much talked about, and ultimately unsuccessful attempt to win the Democratic nomination. What are we to make of Michael Bloomberg's sort of fast rise and fall? He was seen by many to be a savior, the one guy who could beat Trump, and he very quickly kind of obviously spent hundreds of millions of his own dollars, and then didn't get the votes that he wanted. So what does that tell us about party politics and the race in the U.S.?
I think we can talk a bit about the sort of the resources that he probably will bring anyway as a supporter of Mr. Biden, but why did that flop so badly? I mean, it's an example of why politics, I'm not sure all politics is local, but all politics is contextual. And at this particular moment in the Democratic primary, for a multi-gazillionaire New Yorker there's just not a lane for him in that kind of sense. In addition, when he came in after having sort of sat out the first parts of the process, I really think that Elizabeth Warren almost delivered a devastating blow to him before he opened his mouth at the first debate. It was, I've actually never seen such a sort of...
Well, you might have seen it with 4 years ago with the governor of New Jersey against the Florida senator who just devastated Marco Rubio.
Yes.
But you don't see it often, I agree.
It was quite a thing, and Elizabeth Warren, I mean, really in the opening comments just devastated Mr. Bloomberg, and I mean, a real drop the mic sort of moment, and she is clearly proud of it. And she actually talked yesterday about how, I did not succeed, but I took down Bloomberg. And so I would not discount the importance of Senator Warren, who was a powerful person, and she's a person who actually probably split votes, actually. Those who support her could actually go either way to Biden or Sanders. I think she played a major role in that.
There's probably a story that they teach up the street at the business school here. When Walsh and Purina put together a fabulous dog food, it had all sorts of proteins and the right vitamins and everything else, and there was only one problem. The dogs didn't like it. This was a perfect idea, but the dogs didn't like it.
Very interesting. So let's talk a little bit now about November and the campaign that's going to lead up to that. I guess the basic question I would start with is, has President Trump done enough in his 4 years, almost 4 years in power now, to consolidate or even expand his base? And the recent impeachment by the House of Representatives, has that helped him or hindered his chances in any way?
I personally don't think the impeachment is going to be a huge factor one way or the other. The question is, in the electoral map, how do things look vis-a-vis 2016? I think he is relatively strong in the Rust Belt, the upper Midwest states. Even though I stress to add his policies, there's been marginal changes to NAFTA that are actually quite modest, but otherwise he's governed certainly like a quite right-wing Republican with massive tax cuts, extreme regulatory cuts, and has tried to shape that into a new kind of appeal, a nationalist appeal. I think he's strong in the Rust Belt, and I think that will take quite a bit of doing for the Democrats to dislodge. But Mr. Trump certainly has not expanded. I mean, he governs and wins by having an extremely committed base. His support among registered Republicans is extraordinarily high, north of 80%, and he governs in that way. And so that can carry him to another victory, absolutely. He has his sort of map set up. His campaign will repeat what we did in 2016. And
focusing on the states that he needs to win.
Exactly, focusing on basically the upper Midwest and Florida. That plus the states that are reliably Republican would do it.
So in other words, if he wins by one single vote, he will take that as a tremendous, powerful mandate for 4 more years
certainly.
of governing.
No question about that.
I'm not sure that he's increased his appeal by even one person. I mean, he has consolidated and reinforced his field among those who like him. It's one of those cases as the people who like you will still like you, and the people who hate you even more. And so, this race will come down to about 60,000 suburban women within 15 miles of Philadelphia.
Interesting.
That's right, yes.
Yeah. Now, I know one thing, or one major talking point that the president has been talking about over and over is the economy. And every time he seems to be under the gun, he sort of falls back on this notion that under his stewardship, the economy has done really well, and in particular, the stock market. And he keeps pointing to the rise of the stock market. Now, in the last couple of weeks, we've seen what the coronavirus outbreak has done to that. So how does that impact, him on that particular talking point, and does that sort of really pose a challenge to his campaign?
I think it's a matter of framing, right? So if you frame the discussion about the economy in terms of GDP and stock market, then it's a very strong talking point for him, even though in fairness to his predecessor, the recovery and much of the growth rates began, of course, under President Obama.
Right.
But so so that's continued, arguably, because of some of his measures, especially tax cuts for businesses and wealthy individuals. But that's why the Democrats need to change the talking point to the overall well-being of the people. Joe Biden, even in his, I guess you call it victory speech on Tuesday, immediately started talking about healthcare, because the number of uninsured Americans is on the rise again after a considerable decline after the Affordable Care Act. It's about the insecurity about your jobs. It's about the insecurity about Social Security and major entitlement programs that Mr. Trump has made clear that are on the chopping block. So it's going to be a question of how one frames the economy in a short-term kind of stock market sense, or in a kind of how is the well-being of the population sense.
President Reagan ran for re-election asking, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? Ran for campaign. And Trump could plausibly use that line, because even with the stock market declines, people are better off, many people are at least, better off than they were 4 years earlier. But I think this coronavirus undermines the stability of the markets, and it raises questions about health care that the president's going to have to address. People care about health care more this week than they did 5 days ago.
Yes. Yes. Right. So just to pick up on the coronavirus piece, I am curious your thoughts on, if that will have an impact in terms of the fact that we now have the U.S. dealing, and some would say in a kind of muddled, not the best response you might expect from a country that developed. And it perhaps, it raises questions about President Trump's ability to select qualified people to be in certain roles. Do you see, if the coronavirus outbreak does continue through the coming months, will that perhaps be a challenge for the president and the current administration to overcome when they speak to voters?
Well, any other president in this circumstance would have summoned President Obama and President George W. Bush together and said, let's work together and have those two former presidents, one Republican and one Democrat, both of whom he loathes, be at least the titular head of a major American undertaking. But the president in this case is questioning whether the coronavirus is really as serious as people say, and that it's that people like me in the journalistic world created this thing. Although as power as we may have, we don't really have the power to shut down Italy.
I think this is going to be this is an enormous issue. So on the one hand, it's not just that it would be harmful to the economy, it's harmful to the economy that Trump wants to run on, right? So it's harmful to short-term spending and investment. It's harmful on stocks. In the short-term economic growth pattern, which he is the champion of, this really, really hurts. And more to the point also, it's not just that he doesn't seem to have an understanding of what a vaccine is, but also no interest in responding to this outbreak other than saying, in the kind of usual ethno-nationalist sort of way, we're shutting down travel to China. That does not help when there are community-transmitted diseases and transmitted pathogens, which has occurred in the United States since 28 February. That there are clearly people who have the coronavirus who never did travel. That is, they've gotten it subsequent to this. And that is just, he just doesn't do that kind of thing. I mean, I even wonder sometimes if the word administration, which suggests that you're administering the public good, is an apt word for the current administration.
Yeah, but I think this raises another question about the Trump years, and we'll have to find out. And neither journalists nor historians are well suited to answer this question. But is Trump a new kind of president, or is he a diversion or an exception from the line of presidents we've had? And since, not even since Kennedy or Johnson, but really since Carter, and particularly Reagan, our presidents have been pastoral, and they have felt the country's anxieties, and they've spoken to them. I mean, President Reagan's remarkable speech after the death of the astronauts on the Challenger mission, President Clinton at Oklahoma City, President Obama in South Carolina seeing Amazing Grace. These are pastoral moments, and our presidency has become a pastoral enterprise until Trump. And George W. Bush was pastoral in his own way after 9/11, and we don't see the pastoral nature of the presidency right now.
Right.
And I think it's a question that your brethren or your children, historical children, will examine about whether the presidency changed in this matter. President Roosevelt was pastoral, but President Wilson wasn't, President Taft wasn't, President Coolidge surely wasn't, President Hoover was a great failure at that. So it's a notion that we have now, and I wonder whether that the next president, Republican or Democrat, will be pastoral again. What do you think?
I think you're absolutely right that there's a clear difference. I think Trump is a new phenomenon. I really do. I really see him to be distinct, and especially in this regard of your sort of the emotional dimension, if you can say that, of the presidency. Like, you are the only office that represents the entirety of the people, for better or worse, whether they voted for you or not, or sat it out. So there typically is a sort of where the comforter in chief, where you're actually responding to what you think is the emotional quotient of the people. And I mean, whatever else Mr. Trump does or does not do, he does not do that. I mean, he goes directly for the resentments that people have towards other kinds of Americans or to foreigners, and so that is really quite a distinct thing. And I think it, frankly, will be very difficult to recover from.
So at the end of the day, regardless of who ultimately wins the Democratic primary, I mean, is November essentially a referendum on Donald Trump's first 4 years in office, or are there other issues? Like, usually in elections, you talk about issues that are in voters' minds. You mentioned the economy and healthcare, but is this potentially going to be an issues-based campaign, or is it really we want 4 more years of Donald Trump or we don't?
What do you think?
I think there's only one issue in this campaign, and that's Donald Trump. And I'm trying to think of any other election in which that was the case, probably 1936, surely 1944, wouldn't you say? And I think not 1964, not a lot of others. This is about the president. Do you want him to be the president more? I mean, for a longer period, I mean.
Yeah.
And so I think people can talk about healthcare and they can talk about about taxes, but it's really about do you like the Trump style or don't you?
I agree that there's an unprecedented, the divide between those who support Mr. Trump and those who revile him is so dramatic that it's going to be a referendum in that way. I do think, as a slight asterisk, I do think healthcare is going to be really sort of have a kind of semi-independent power here, though, because it really is a big deal that the gains of modest or otherwise of the Affordable Care Act have been systematically eroded, and that more and more people are going to be healthcare insecure. I think it's a major issue, even if there would not be this outbreak. With this outbreak and with those concerns, I think that'll be a major part of the campaign, and I think the Democrats would be smart to do so, to talk about that.
You're going to hear 4 syllables over and over again: pre-existing conditions.
Yes.
And whether the president who says to some audiences that he will protect people with pre-existing conditions and to others that he doesn't give a hoot about them, that's going to be a big, big issue. And I think that the Democrats are going to be able to make some hay with that. But whether they make some hay, whether the sun's shining while they're making that hay is the question.
That's right. That's right. So we received a number of questions that have come in from the audience. So let me just get to a couple of them. Peter Black was wondering, what unorthodox tactics is Trump's group likely to use to win, and how can Democrats prevent or counter these?
I think he's definitely likely to use unorthodox moves. He'll do things like tweet about one particular Democratic candidate, partly to seem like he's favoring that person, but also to turn other Democrats against them. He'll do all kinds of things like this. He runs very well in chaos. To counter that, I think what the Democrats should do, and this is what, regardless of who the nominee is, they need to have a basically coherent message that can kind of, to use the medical terms, to sort of vaccinate the population against those kinds of appeals, and say you're going to hear a lot about this. You're going to hear a lot about how we can divide one Democrat against the other, or one American against the other, and the campaign that we're trying to run is something different. But I fully suspect that there will be all those remaining kind of norms in American politics about decency in politics, or at this level at least, will be severely challenged, if not blown down.
Before anybody writes in, pre-existing conditions is 6 syllables, not 4.
Right.
I apologize for that. But I think the very presence of Trump in the White House itself is unconventional enough. And so the Trump style, as we've been talking about, of vicious tweets and criticizing everybody, that's still jarring to a lot of people.
And I guess the question, as you mentioned earlier, whether we have 4 more years of Trump or a few more months of Trump, at some point we're going to move on from Donald Trump. Is this the new norm for U.S. elections and campaigns, or do we then go back to this more civil, pastoral?
Well, I mean, I think Trump inadvertently has understood the appeal of Joe Biden by calling him Uncle Joe, and so his would be an avuncular presidency, probably 1 term, I would guess. Teddy Roosevelt didn't do well by saying at the outset of 1905 that he wouldn't run for another term. But I think before the election, it might be wise for Biden to say, I'm here to take 4 years to recreate and to restore this country. And that might salve some people's concerns about his age. It also would bring a lot of attention, as Andrew Cohen said in today's Globe and Mail, a lot of attention on who the vice president is.
Yes.
Yes.
That's right.
Now, Lyndon Johnson did not want to be vice president, but he calculated that 1/3 or something of vice presidents become president. Well, you don't have to work for a life insurance company to understand that being a vice presidential nominee this time around is a pretty good deal.
Right, and maybe we'll have time to get to who that person might be. But let me just get to a couple of other questions. MC Legault in Toronto has written in, and we talked a little bit about this, but I'll ask the question anyway. How do you rate Joe Biden's chances of effectively and strongly debating and sharing the stage with Donald Trump? Trump is undeniably adept at tearing down his opponents. Meanwhile, Biden gets rattled and struggles to get his message out.
Well, I don't know. We don't know whether I don't know if any political scientists have determined this, whether the Trump debate performances against Hillary Clinton were dispositive or not. I think Trump will have the advantage in a debate with Biden. I thought it was possible that Trump wouldn't debate at all, and he's suggested that maybe he won't. He's debating with the whole country every day. Somebody once said I forget which baseball player, that he was so angry, Ty Cobb, that he would climb a mountain to punch an echo.
Very even-tempered. He's always furious.
Yes, right. And so it's a total unpredictability. I do know one thing. Had Elizabeth Warren been the nominee and had Trump pulled that stunt of walking behind her during the, she'd have turned around and said, "What the hell are you doing?"
This was a moment that Trump really did kind of, it was awkward walking right behind Hillary Clinton in one of the debates, and she later said it rattled her, and she's a quite experienced debater.
Right. Well, it didn't rattle
Having
Elizabeth.
When he did. Yes, that's true. That's true.
So speaking of Elizabeth Warren, actually, the next question actually comes in from Mercedes. Thank you, Mercedes, for sending this in. She writes that yesterday we witnessed Elizabeth Warren exit the race. What does it say for the second presidential cycle in a row that perhaps the most qualified candidate was unable to break through the glass ceiling and win a presidential election? Are women politicians held to a different standard than men?
Hold it. Is Elizabeth Warren, with 1.5 terms in the Senate, more qualified, as much as I admire Elizabeth Warren, and I've seen her many times, and she's a fabulous campaigner, and I'm stunned at her fall. Is she more qualified than a 4 or 5 term senator, 2-term vice president? I don't know. So I'm not sure it's a question of qualifications. She surely had legitimate qualifications, more legitimate qualifications, I might add, than Barack Obama when he became president. But I think that the question of qualifications, first of all, is moot in an era when millennials vote, is moot in an area where you have a president who not only didn't serve in the military, but also didn't even have 15 minutes in office before he became president. So I think, I don't know about the experience thing. John Kennedy ran against Richard Nixon when Richard Nixon said, experience, experience, experience. and he lost that election. So I'm not sure.
I was looking at some of the data, sort of thinking about this. What evidence can we look at to say that sexism played a role in Elizabeth Warren's defeat? And there are certain quantifiable things about favorability and likability ratings that do seem to suggest that. But I'd also say, too, there's a general thing about being in the Trump era in the United States, or being an American in the Trump era, which is that the context of, frankly, fear can have this profoundly conservative effect on everyone, in the sense that we have to be the safest possible choice against Mr. Trump. So many Democrats will say this. And then, by its very nature, of course, a woman as the candidate does not feel as safe because it's not as familiar. So I think that did play a role. But as I would second to say that Elizabeth Warren is an exceptionally formidable person as a debater, as a thinker, as a policymaker, and as a campaigner. They tried to dismiss her as, this Harvard professor is not going to come off well. No, she's a very, very earnest campaigner. She's very, very savvy about how she addresses people, and I'm stunned at how quickly she...
I saw every one of these candidates this year, and I think the biggest mystery isn't the mystery of Biden's rise or the mystery of Sanders' persistence, but the mystery of her fall, because she's by far the best campaigner I saw all year, by far.
I agree.
And she did have a plan for everything. And maybe it is sexism, maybe it's, who knows? But I don't dismiss the sexism notion. But you go to Elizabeth Warren events, I've been to several, and she is captivating, and she is personable. There's nothing, you spend 15 minutes there and you're never going to ask that likability question again.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting. One more question that we received from Randy Weitzner, who's the chair of the Montreal chapter of Democrats Abroad. Thank you, Randy, for writing in. He's asking about your thoughts on the thousands of U.S. citizens who live outside of the country but are eligible to vote in the federal election. Given the conflicted nature of U.S. politics and government at this moment, will the role of absentee balloting become more important this year?
That's a great question. I'm not sure about absentee balloting itself. It's possible in certain kinds of very narrow results. I do think that early voting will be an important thing. It's really interesting data from Super Tuesday that shows a dramatic rise in turnout in those states that shifted from caucuses to primaries. Yeah. Because you just go in and vote and don't have to sit around for 2 hours. So making things easier to vote, people vote more. Mm-hmm. And early voting has become more and more easy for people with hectic schedules and childcare concerns. So I think early voting will be a big deal, probably more so than
yeah. And if I were Joe Biden, I'd encourage people to vote the day before the debates.
Not a bad idea.
Yeah.
Not a bad idea.
I think you've answered a couple of questions with that short answer. I want to ask a little bit. We talked earlier about some of the, Joe Biden's success in the South, and you talked about sort of how, at least on the Democratic side, Bernie Sanders seems to be doing well in the West. The Midwest is a bit of a battleground, and we hear a lot about sort of the voters being cut around racial, gender, and religious lines. I'm wondering your thoughts, though. There seems to be emerging now a real shift between sort of the rural and urban votes, whether they're sort of the urban, educated, coastal elites, some would call them. And we're seeing that not just in the U.S. I think here in Canada, in the last couple of elections, we've also seen this kind of, more rural, Western-based split taking shape versus the kind of Eastern, urban, Montreal, Toronto, Ottawa angle. So any thoughts on that?
Well, if you take a look at the map, you'll see that the Trump vote increases with every mile from the city center, every mile from Pittsburgh, every mile from Philadelphia, every mile from New York City. So there is a rural-urban thing that we really, I don't think, have seen since 1896.
It's been a long time. Yep.
Yeah, maybe 1920. But you don't see this very often, and it's cultural. And if you're going to be the president of the United States, you ought to worry about that, because you don't want a rural-urban division, because that creates real populism, not the kind of Trump populism.
I mean, there's clear patterns this way. There's also, it's interesting to note, though, that there are patterns that sort of go that move through that divide. So, for example, voters of color, regardless if they're in the rural areas or in urban areas, have strongly voted Democratic, and will, I think, continue to do so. This is why in the South you see a sort of blue band to the middle of the Deep South. This is predominantly African American areas. So there are really powerful racial dynamics at play.
And those people used to be Republican. I mean,
that's right.
Rural America used to be Republican.
Absolutely.
I mean, where do you think Herbert Hoover came from? West Branch, Iowa.
There is a very old thing. I think this is slightly more present in the United States than in Canada. or in other Western democracies, there is this very old rhetoric of rural association with virtue, rural association with the real people.
Goes back to Jefferson, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And cities being motley and metropolitan and corrupt and somehow less real. And I think that a smart presidential campaigner would concretely address the undeniable hollowing out of many rural communities with deindustrialization. They would address basic things like access to healthcare in places where there aren't many hospitals. And they would also make a case for just because someone lives in an urban area, they're not any less of a real American. What a strange elite it would be if it's smaller than the number of people who voted for.
Because his presidential campaigns tended to bomb early, Biden has special knowledge of Iowa.
Yes.
Okay, which is a state he could take. Democratic candidates would go into Iowa and they'd have a 15-minute seminar on price supports and have a corn dog and get the hell out of there as soon as they could, or get back to Des Moines and Cedar Rapids. I mean, he can do this, and that's something they ought to think about a little bit. Do you think?
I agree. I agree. And I think that there is a sort of an idea of making, concretely addressing rural concerns.
It's more than ethanol. It's
more than just the exporters of agricultural products.
Right.
Absolutely.
But you can talk tariffs this time where you couldn't talk last time.
That's right.
Right. So let me go through. We've just got a few more questions that have actually just come in.
Sure.
We only have a few minutes left. So let me go through and maybe some quicker answers. But Mark Peacock, specifically for you, David, he's asking if you can elaborate on the point you made about the 60,000 suburban women in Philadelphia who will determine the election.
Okay, well, maybe it's 48,000 or something, but it's some number in there. But the people who changed the character of the House of Representatives in 2008 tended to be women in suburbs. And these voters could be suspicious of Donald Trump. They could be contemptuous of him. They could be uncomfortable with him. That's the target audience. And so I think you need to target, if you're a Democrat, you need to target those kinds of voters. Suburban women voters are a huge part of this Democratic coalition if they can get them. And so we're not talking about California. No one's going to campaign for more than 10 minutes in California. That's going Democratic. So is Massachusetts. So is New Jersey and New York. So you have to choose places like the outer rings of Cleveland, Cincinnati, which is traditionally Republican, Columbus, because you might want to get work the Ohio number, and you need to worry about the suburbs around Denver. And it's what really I found perplexing yesterday. I don't know, this week, you may have felt the same way. Was that Biden swept everything, but he didn't win Colorado, and Colorado is going to be a really important state next time. A lot of Latinos there. There's the marijuana issue. There's all sorts of things there. And so I think suburban voters are really going to be the key to this election.
Right.
In about 10 states. I wouldn't bother campaigning in the other 40.
All right. Tisa Aberrante has written in. She wants to know how much will Joe Biden be hurt by his past record, thinking of his questioning of Anita Hill during the Clarence Thomas trial. I'm sure the Republicans have videotape of that.
Yes, they also don't come off very well in that tape either. But I don't necessarily think that, the left side of the Democratic Party will want to hear from Biden about NAFTA. They'll want to hear from Biden about the crime bill.
In Iraq.
Yep, and absolutely the Iraq War. That actually seems more on the Democratic side. On the Republican side, my personal feeling is I don't think that the Trump efforts to link, which are quite circumlocuted, linking Biden to his son and Burisma in Ukraine will do much. I mean, Joe Biden has a very long career. A lot of the skeletons or whatever from his closets have been thoroughly vetted in past campaigns. Mm-hmm. So I think it'll be actually perhaps more on the Democratic side that his record will be a matter of dispute.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that when you're in the Senate, when you're elected to the Senate at 29 and you leave there to become vice president, you have so many votes that you're vulnerable for that,
Mm-hmm.
Okay. There'll be a few that'll stand out. But
sure.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
We referenced vice presidents earlier, and we just got a question from Trina, who's asking what kind of considerations should the Democratic presidential candidates take into account this election when choosing their vice presidential candidate?
I have strong feelings on this one.
I'm sure you do.
Richard Nixon used to say, that you should, and he's as smart as they come. It's a sentence I never thought as a young man I would ever say. But he's as smart as they come. And he said the vice president can only help you by winning his or her state. So I think the Democrats need somebody who can give them a state they wouldn't ordinarily get. And I'm thinking particularly of Ohio and Georgia.
Do you have any one particular in mind that you're thinking of?
Well, in Ohio it would be Senator, who's this, I've forgotten his name, and in Georgia it would be Stacey Abrams. And you could maybe think about Minnesota because Klobuchar did so well there, and President Trump came that close to taking Minnesota.
I was going to say that I think that they might if Mr. Biden is the nominee, that's still a big if.
Right.
If he were to be the nominee, I think that they should seriously consider Amy Klobuchar. She was a quite impressive campaigner. Yeah. There are many kind of on the more left side of the party who are actually more worried about her than Biden until recently. So, and that's very much a state in the region of contention. So I agree. You basically want to go with erring on the side of your ticket. And frankly, also would not hurt to diversify the ticket in terms of age, gender, and race. I mean,
the Ohio Senator would be Sherrod Brown, but he has a disadvantage of being a white male. But he has the advantage of being married to a journalist.
Right. So I know we're almost out of time, but if you have 5 more minutes, there's a couple more questions that come in, if we can just get to them. Pierre has written to us. There's a couple of questions in here. He did ask about Trump's, the effect that Trump had on the takeover of the Republican Party, which I think we sort of addressed. But the second part of his question is interesting. I had a whole bunch of questions around social media and the role that social media might play in this election. He's asking how important was the use of Donald Trump's 71 million Twitter followers. And so perhaps you can weigh in on that, but I think it also speaks to a larger question, which is what role, I mean, we've gone from, the old traditional, you talked about sort of listening to candidates in debates and reading reports in the news media. It seems now people are getting their news much more from Twitter, from Facebook, hearing from the candidates directly, or sort of building sort of partisan-inspired feeds in their social media. What role will all of that play, including Donald Trump's, very large Twitter audience? Well,
if I were a Democratic strategist, I would really not try to break into the Donald Trump camp. I mean, they're extremely motivated around this. Don't try to do that. The idea is to actually build and address people who could be swayed one or the other. Suburban voters is a very large one. And then turning out voters who otherwise stayed home. I mean, a lot of Mr. Trump's success in the Rust Belt was not working class people suddenly shifting, although that did happen. It was many Democrats not showing up. This is good data for this, especially in Ohio and Pennsylvania. So you try to go after, I think the idea is whether it's through Twitter, whether it's through new kinds of media or traditional media, which Mr. Biden shows he can still do very well, you're smart as to who you go after, and you simply don't waste the time and energy trying to convince someone who reviles you and has absolutely no interest whatsoever in ever even coming close to voting for you.
And here the journalist and the historian are going to swap places. Technology has been a huge part in American politics. President Roosevelt harnessed the airplane and radio. President Kennedy harnessed television. President Obama began to harness the internet, and surely President Trump has harnessed social media. So I think you are taking a big risk if you don't play in the new game.
Yeah. Okay. That's very, very fascinating. Something to look out for sure. Before we wrap up, we have obviously 2 McGill professors with us. And I think I'd be remiss not to ask a little bit about your experiences in working with McGill students today. I'm just curious to get your take on what's happening in the Faculty of Arts and in the Max Bell School of Public Policy in terms of educating the students. Are you finding that the students we're working with, whether they're locals from here in Montreal or international students, American students, what is their sort of outlook or appetite towards careers in politics and political science and sort of the arts and humanities? And do you see that there's a real passion for that here?
I certainly do. I would be remiss to say that I've not also noticed a dramatic change since 2016. A much more politicized environment, mostly among Americans. I have a lot of American students in my class, but pretty much from everyone. But more generally, I would say in the Faculty of Arts, there's really kind of 2 real centers of power, or two real new dynamics. One of them is multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary work. where you have someone in my department who's an archaeologist who does work, who does digs in Italy and is connecting that to nutrition in the ancient world. So interdisciplinary work, there's a lot of energy around that. And then in addition, there's simply the recognition that perhaps in pushing back at the world of fake news, that taking in information, verifying it, looking at it carefully, and communicating it clearly. If people do that, then societies function. If they don't do that or can't do that, societies don't function. And so I've really been motivated to go back to some basics, like what is your source for that? Let me see the proper citation. You're not being clear here. Don't try to be smart about what you're saying. Be clear about it. And I think that is that's been a healthy kind of energy in the Faculty of Arts.
I would say this, that if any of our viewers here are McGill alumni and have children here, make sure they take this guy's course.
No, thank you.
Okay? I have students from all over the world at Max Bell. I took 25 of them to the New Hampshire primary for 2 or 3 days. 2 or 3 days, and taught a course on the American political system, mostly on the presidency, and I thought that these students took to it with avidity and with real dedication and commitment. They got good grades because they earned them. They worked very, very hard, and I was very, very impressed with these students. And I think that if we could populate the world with students like the ones I had and the ones I know that you have, be a better place.
Great, great. Well, I think we now are officially out of time or past time. Before we end, I obviously want to thank both of you, Jason and David, for coming out today and taking your time to share some really incredible insight and some history lessons with us today. If you like what you heard and you want to support McGill's efforts in the Faculty of Arts, in the Max Bell School of Public Policy, or anywhere else, of course, across our campuses, well, you can do that any day. But in particular, I want to point out next Wednesday, March 11th, is McGill 24, which is a day, our annual one-day, 24-hour fundraiser where any gifts made to the university will be matched and amplified. So that's a good opportunity to send your support back to the university if you'd like. Last thing I would say is just, again, to just please stay tuned to your emails and McGill alumni social media feeds, where we'll have news about our next Made by McGill alumni webcast, hopefully in a couple of weeks. Thank you very much.